We'll start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alice Bergouin. I work on energy poverty at FEANTSA. So first, I want to thank all of you for being here, and especially our speakers, Mr. Petr Ulier from the Czech Ministry of the Environment, Ms. Anna Wall from Deutsche Umwelthilfe, Mr. Stanislas Jourdan from Positive Money Europe, and Mr. Felix Mailleux from the European Trade Union Confederation. I want to say also a special thank you to Ms. Kira Taylor from Euractiv, who will be moderating this roundtable. So we quickly introduce FEANTSA and why we plan this roundtable and give the floor to Kira. So FEANTSA is the European Federation of National Organizations working with the homeless. Our work on energy poverty is based on the right to affordable and adequate housing. We think that the Fit for 55 package could be an opportunity to support poor households in the energy transition and even address housing exclusion. But we also realize that initiatives such as the Social Climate Fund do not clearly establish the safeguards that are needed to protect these vulnerable households during the transition. We wrote a position paper on the Social Climate Fund. It's available on our website. There we strongly criticize the extension of the emission trading scheme to transport and buildings. But because we think that the Social Climate Fund is essential, our goal is to influence the debate at the European level and propose alternatives to the ETS2 to finance it. With today's event, we want to stimulate the collective intelligence and show that we can be creative and that alternatives exist to finance a socially just renovations. We are also currently preparing a report specifically on the use of the ETS1 to fund renovation programs, and it will be surely enriched by the examples we will explore today. So without further ado, I will let Kira introduce the debate.
Thank you, Alice. Well, welcome again, everyone, to this event on how to finance the Social Climate Fund, organised by FEANTSA. I'm Kira Taylor. I'm a journalist covering energy and environment policy in Brussels. Today, I'll be moderating our discussion as we look at alternative financing methods for the Social Climate Fund. So as most of you know, the fund was proposed last year to shield vulnerable households from high energy prices and to drive investments in green technology. It is part of a package of legislation that was tabled in July to align Europe with its climate goals. The package also includes a new emissions trading scheme for road transport and buildings. That is on top of the current ETS, which focus on industrial sectors. A quarter of those revenues from this new ETS will go directly to the Social Climate Fund, and that would total about 72 billion euros over a 7-year period, and EU countries would then have to co-finance that. As Vice President Frans Timmermans put it, no ETS extension, no Social Climate Fund. But although a fund to help the estimated 30 to 50 million Europeans who live in energy poverty in Europe is welcomed by many, the idea of trying to tie it to a carbon price that would directly impact citizens is very controversial in Brussels. So EU countries, lawmakers and NGOs have warned about the impact this could have. They're also concerned that the Social Climate Fund just isn't big enough to mitigate the impact of ETS2 and also provide money for green investments. And now we're seeing high energy prices, which are likely to stay high into 2023, according to the European Commission. So the idea of tying the Social Climate Fund to the carbon price for road transport and buildings has become even more controversial than it was. But the high energy prices also mean that there is a need for a fund that would supply direct payments and also drive green investments. Investments in energy efficiency like home renovations are also critical to reducing Europe's greenhouse gas emissions and its reliance on Russian fossil fuels. Energy efficiency measures were highlighted in the European Commission's Repower EU plan presented last week, for instance. So today we are going to look at alternative methods of financing that Social Climate Fund. We have 3 panels that will look at using revenues from the original emissions trading scheme, revenues from new taxes, and also using the European Central Bank to drive green investment. To clear up any confusion, although I'm sure most of you already know this, we will be talking about 2 emission trading schemes today. So the current ETS, also called ETS1, which covers industrial sectors like energy production and carbon-intensive industries, and the extension to road transport and buildings, which most people now call ETS2. That would be a separate emissions trading scheme and was proposed in July 2021 and is currently under negotiation. So over the course of today's event, each speaker will have the chance to present their ideas on how to fund the Social Climate Fund differently from this new ETS, and there will be a space for Q&A after each of their presentations. You can join in with this debate by tweeting using the hashtag #NoETS2. You can also submit your questions to our panelists during the session. Please use the chat function at the base of your screen. The session is also being recorded, so you can catch up on it afterwards. So without further ado, we turn to our first panel, which will look at how the Czech Republic and Germany have used ETS revenues to finance renovation and what lessons can be learned from this. We'll start in the Czech Republic, which in 2009 started implementing its new green savings program, an energy efficiency program that recycled carbon revenues as investments. From 2014 to 2021, it was financed by revenues from the emissions trading scheme. In that period, 77,000 people benefited from its support and were paid a total of 11 billion Czech koruna. The next phase, until 2025, is funded by the EU's COVID recovery money. However, there is criticism of the Czech scheme as there are barriers for low-income households wanting to access it. So to talk us through how renovation was funded by ETS revenues and the improvements that could be made to allow better access for low-income households, we have Petr Uvěr. He is an architect working for the Ministry for Environment in the Czech Republic to look at how they could improve the scheme. So, Petr, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will switch to the presentation, just a second. Okay. I would like to present some information about the new green saving program. Let's use NGS for shortcut for the program. At first, I would like to say NGS is a subsidy program of Ministry of Environment of the Czech Republic, and the program is administered by State Environmental Fund. New Green Saving program is the most efficient and long-lasting subsidy program designed for energy saving of family and apartment houses in Czech Republic. As you said before, it started in 2009. The program was financed from revenues of emission allowance, but the current stage of new green saving program is part of recovery and resilience facility. The program has gone through several phases, as you said also in the beginning, and it has been gradually upgraded. The setting of the program, of the current stage of the program, is based on the direction of the European Union, especially strategy of European Commission, the European Green Deal, and the current goals of Czech Republic within the EU in the field of energy savings and also economic recovery after coronavirus crisis. Here are some more details about the approved and paid applications. As you see on the upper side, there is the last previous stage of the program, and the current stage down there. It is the number of received applicants since the end of the last year, since September 2021. The program helps also in the economic spheres. It helps to increase the competitiveness of small and medium-sized companies and offers various job opportunities. New Green Saving is mainly for owners, builders, housing cooperatives, developers, municipalities and cities. And also for common people who wants to buy a flat or house in better passive or mainly passive standards. Energy standards are based on requirements of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan according to European regulations. Here are the main requirements for the renovations, new constructions and energy sources. The program New Green Saving is financed from component 2.5, building renovation and air protection, the same as other subsidy programs that aims to raise awareness and education in the field of energy savings. And in particular, it means in the field of pre-project preparation, construction and advice in energy consulting and information centers, and also ecological education centers. From this support, there should be also part that supports establish of new energy communities, but this part of the program is still in preparation, so we are working on it. So I cannot say more about this now, so we can move further. And supported measures within New Green Saving program are divided into several areas, A, B, C, D, E, and we will look more detailed in the other slides. As I said before, program supports residential sector building, family houses and apartment houses. For apartment we use blue color, and for family houses green. Here are the areas. Area A supports energy saving in existing buildings, in particular measures on the envelope of the building. For the blue one, again for the apartment buildings, and green one for family houses. Sorry. Area B supports construction of energy efficient new buildings as the solid, and Area C supports energy sources. Here, replacement of heat sources or hot water preparation systems, photovoltaic systems, ventilation systems, or heat from wastewater. And similar measures for family houses. Area D supports adaptation and mitigation measures, shading technology, green roofs, rainwater systems, or eco-mobility, which is chargers for electric cars, and for greenery for apartment houses, and the similar one for family houses, just without greenery, because they have their own garden. Area E supports projects and assessments. New Green Saving also offers motivational bonuses, bonus for structural disadvantaged regions, combination bonus for combination with pot subsidies. It is a program from operational program for of environment, and also bonus for environmentally friendly project solution. This support is for environmental materials used on the building. Last but not least, I will mention some formal informations. The support is always paid ex post. Application is possible to make before, during, and after the implementation of the measures. And all the communication is electronic, also submission of applications. On the website of the program, you can find all the needed informations and list of specialists, list of products and technologies, so on. And in the end, some information on tackling energy poverty within a new green saving program. Some measures have been supplemented and some are still in preparation. So, as I said before, the program started at the end of last year in autumn, and so we are still there are still some parts that are in preparation. The first point is connected to bonus for combination with pot subsidies. As I said, it is combination with operational program of environment. It is high-level support for low-income households for replacement of heat sources, and energy reconstruction of apartment houses with social flat is being prepared, and it will be connected to other subsidy program for social flats of Ministry of Regional Development. And the third measure is cooperation with State Investment Support Fund on loans of low-income households for pre-financing energy reconstruction is also ongoing. So we are working on these two parts, and they should be there should be new calls in the second part of this year. So this was the basic part of or basic informations about the new green saving program. So I think we don't have more time, but you can stop me if you want. But I have some examples of reconstruction, but we can.
Thank you. I'm sure later. We can get into a bit. I'm sure we can go a bit into that in the Q&A. But for the moment, let's move across to Germany, which has a refurbishment program partially funded by the ETS. In 2017, the Energy and Climate Fund allocated financial support to modernize 275,000 dwellings. To look more into this, we have Anna Wolf, a policy advisor on energy and climate from Deutsche Umwelthilfe, or Environmental Action Germany in English, which is a bit easier for me to say. She will present her ideas on improving allocation for renovations targeted at low-income households. Just before I give her the floor, I'll remind our audience that they can put in questions for both Anna and Petter. Please put those in the chat and we'll get to ask them after Anna's presentation. But now over to you, Anna, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Let me just check if I can open the presentation. That should be working right now. You can see it? Yeah.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you. So yeah, I wanted to give you some information about the German funding scheme for energy efficient buildings, how the funds of the ETS and the German carbon pricing are used for it. and yeah, show you how the funding has not been used the most efficient way. So first of all, you mentioned the Energy and Climate Fund. By the way, it is now called, I just looked it up, the Climate and Transformation Fund. It was set up in 2011, and it finances several measures for climate protection, climate mitigation, renewable energies, shifts in the transport sector, for example, for electronic vehicles, and of course, the funding scheme for energy efficient buildings. And I brought you here the planning for the federal budget for 22, which is from August 22. We're actually waiting for the second draft, which will be published tomorrow. So the numbers are a bit outdated, but I brought them anyways just to give you an idea. So you can see the revenues from the ETS. Actually, the newest number is from 2021 that the revenues were about 5 billion actually. Then we have the revenues from the German carbon pricing, which was introduced in 2021. And it represents the carbon pricing for the transport sector and the building sector. And consumers pay a fixed price per ton CO2, and in 2021 it started at 25 euros per ton, and it will gradually increase up to 55 euros per ton in 2025. There are some flaws to it, and if I have time, I'd like to come back to that in the end, but if not, maybe in the discussion. You also see that we have a bit of federal budget coming in, some reserves, and the last line here is the expenditures for the BEG. We call it Bundesförderung effiziente Gebäude. So that is the funding for energy efficient buildings. And as you can see, the red numbers in the original financial plan, we had the 5.7 billion in 21. And by the end of the year, they had increased that to 18 billion. For this year, we have 11 billion, and the newest numbers for the next years predict about 13 to 14 billion for the next years. The problem with that is a bit, you can see a lot of question mark. It's not very transparent where that money is actually coming from, which budget is going to be used. And we actually have the Council of Experts on Climate Change who evaluated the scheme in 2021 for the previous year, though. And even they stated that it remains unclear from where which amount is going to be funded. So one of our demands is one is a long-term planning on how the fundings will be used and more transparency. Now, I just brought a really, really brief overview over the funding for energy efficient buildings itself, because it is a bit complicated. Basically, the system, as you can see it now, has been set up in 2021 and is basically a facelift of two older programs that were also financed via the Energy and Climate Fund. The new system, as you can see it now, was meant to be a step towards the one-shop solution, but it got just more complicated from our point of view. You have two institutions responsible. You have the KfW Bank, which is like a promotional bank, and you have the federal, I have to check it up, Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control, who manages another part of the program. Basically, the program is divided into three different sub-programs. The first one is for residential buildings and includes new buildings and full renovations. You have the sub-program for individual measures, which offers grants of 20% for installation and other measures, and for the exchange of the heating system, up to 50% are possible. For example, if you have an old oil heating and replace it, say, with a heat pump, up to 50% are possible. And then you have the sub-program for non-residential buildings, which I will not be talking about today. Then within these programs, you can always choose between direct investment grants, like on your investment, you get the direct grant of 15–20%, or you can take on a loan and get a repayment bonus of a certain percentage of that loan. And within the new buildings, we have different standards, and it is not that easy to explain that even in Germany, because they refer to a reference building, and then you have to compare the reference buildings with standard values with the building that you're actually constructing, and it's all relative, so to say. But as a rule of thumb, you could say the 1455 standards are somewhat A+ and A. And here it goes up to A+, A, B, 85 is maybe a D, so somewhat around that. And the problem is now, at the beginning, I was showing that we had a big increase between 2019, 2020, and 2021 in the amount of funding that went into the BEG-Förderung. And the problem that we see is that most of that additional funding went into the construction of new buildings, and the biggest share into the A standard, which from our point of view for newly constructed building is not in line with the climate goals. And you can see here in the previous years, we had like 300,000 euros that went into this 55 standard. And until 2020 also, the percentage was way lower. Like in 2019, for a building of that 55 standard, you got 5%. And then in 22, it got increased to 15%. So if you construct a new building to a standard that is not going to be in line with the 2045 goals, you still got 15% of investment grant or loan repayment. And we criticize that highly because the 55 standard is somewhat already state of the art in construction. So it was like not even an additional effort you had to take to get this funding. And the consequences are what you can see in the graph on the right, is that most of the funding that was added was spent for the construction of new building rather than for construction of the existing building stock. And about 95% of the German buildings were constructed before 2012. And yet more than 60% of the funding went into the construction of new buildings. We had a lot of housing companies that applied as well. And you can see, while it was almost balanced in 2019, in 2021, the highest share went just into the new construction. And if you look at the German building sector, almost half of it is still in the worst efficiency. So there's a lot, the major work to be done is actually in the existing building stock. And that led the previous government actually in November 2021 to announce that the 55 standard will be pushed out of the funding, which led to a huge run on the program. So the government actually had to announce in January this year that they had to stop and reassess the funding, because already the number of funding that was applied to 2022 was reached. So the current status that the 55 will end, and the funding for new buildings to the A+ standard is limited to 1 billion to make sure that the rest of the funding can go into the existing building stock. And they are planning to set up a new program for new buildings. And what we suggest is actually there has been studies done. What we would need to do a full renovation of the building stock is a funding of 25 billion per year for the existing building stock. and that should also focus on climate compatible standard, which is the better classes. And what we are currently discussing, but we do not have a concept for it yet here at German Environmental Action, when we introduce minimum performance standards, we should consider, because now everyone can apply, private homeowners, housing companies, anyone, that there should be a bonus for private homeowners with a low income. But that is just our idea as so far. And I don't know if I still have a minute left, then I would come to the carbon pricing.
Yeah, very quickly, please.
Okay. Then I would just point out the major problem. So Germany introduced the CO2 pricing for buildings, and the problem is in Germany, tenants pay 100% of this CO2 pricing. Germany has 60% of the households are tenants. And as of now, they pay the full CO2 price, while they have no choice in when and how the house is going to be renovated or which heating system is used. And currently they're discussing a fairer distribution. There's a 50-50 model, or a model that splits up the percentages according to the CO2 consumption of the building. And the rest maybe we can come back to in the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you both for talking us through that. I think my first question looking at all of that is that they're very good schemes, but sometimes they can be very complicated for people to understand. So Anna, maybe let's start with you. How can Germany make this understandable for people? How can they help people access this better?
There's currently studies published, for example, to simplify the system of the efficiency standards. Like I explained, it's very complicated. You have this reference building and so on. And the idea is, for example, to just put a maximum value on CO2 emissions per square meter that have to be reached, combined with an efficiency factor, like the final energy consumption, for example, to have just clear numbers that have to be reached that are easy to understand, and probably to avoid having two different institutions depending on which kind of program and which program you're applying to.
So maybe let's bring this over to you. How would it work in the Czech Republic? How can government and maybe banks help people really engage with renovation?
Pardon, could you say it again? I have some hush in my earphones.
Of course.
Sorry.
How can the government help people understand these schemes and help them apply for renovation?
We are trying to find the way how to motivate the people to use our subsidy title more and more, how to or rise the awareness about the energy efficiency projects, but the problem, which is the present problem, that we see nowadays, is in how to say, not enough people in the building sector. The Czech Republic, especially, is quite how to say. Quite in Czech Republic, here are many workers from Ukraine, and this crisis, this present crisis, is quite changing the building sector nowadays. So we don't have a big deal with not enough projects, but we have a big deal with the realization of these projects nowadays. So these are the problems we are in daily touch with these things or issues, how to say.
And the European Commission has suggested to EU countries that they can use ETS revenues for things like renovation. So what would be your advice? What would be the key thing you would say for another country trying to use these revenues for renovations?
I think this is there are very various problems in different countries in EU. For example, in our country, there are many ways how to use revenues from ETS. For example, as I said in my presentation, there were previous stage of the program, of the subsidy program, New Green Saving, that were financed from the revenues, but nowadays we use the RRF, Resilience, Recovery and Resilience Facility, which showed as more or better source for the program. So, but in the future we are thinking or how to say, counting to come back to revenues, to finance the program from the revenues, but there are many opportunities how to use the revenues, especially in Czech Republic. There are quite live discussion between resorts, between ministries. So we will see how it will be in the end of the year 2025. So
Thank you.
I cannot say more details because it's still ongoing. Yeah.
Thank you. And Anna, maybe bringing this over to you before we close this panel, what would be your main advice to countries trying to use ETS revenues for renovation?
Maybe 2 points. One point would be to have a long-term planning, so that the industry, the crafting industry, everyone has a clear picture of where this is going, that there's a long-term goal, because right now we even face a shortage of craftsmen in the building sector, so that there's a long-term picture. In general, get the building sector out of the shadow, because it's been greatly undervalued from my point of view. And for the consumers, everyone should have access to an individual renovation roadmap, free, but maybe even mandatory, so everyone has an idea where to go with the building in the next years.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to Petter as well. A quick reminder to our audience that they can share their views on today's event using the hashtag #NoETS2. And now we can move on to our second panel. Our next speaker will look at how the European Central Bank can incentivize private banks to make more money available for green investments. In 2020, a report from Positive Money Europe found that by changing the ECB's targeted long-term refinancing operations program to focus on the climate, it could make green lending much more affordable for small businesses and households. So to talk us through incentivizing cheap financing for banks investing in the climate, we have Stan Jordan, the Executive Director of the Brussels-based NGO Positive Money Europe. After his presentation, we'll have some time for questions for him, so keep submitting them. Stan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kara, and the organizers of this nice event. I'm very happy about the presentation of my predecessor, because I think it sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about. So yeah, I think I'm going to talk about the European Central Bank, but actually I'm going to talk about banks in general, because we have not talked a lot about them, but ultimately I think this is what the topic is, and I think what the ECB can do is simply support what banks will do ultimately. So maybe just to don't get too much worried about the technicality of what the central banks do. I won't talk too much about that actually. So never mind. Yes, we're an NGO, as you've said. We're focusing on the European Central Bank. Our mission is to make the ECB support a more fair, democratic, and sustainable economy. And so part of our work for the last 5 years has been to push the European Central Bank in Frankfurt to basically take climate change seriously. Which they kind of finally do, so they're taking a step there. But as you said, I think our next step is to go even further by really getting the European Central Bank to incentivize banks to lend for home renovation. Just First of all, just to put things into context a little bit, of course, it's a big topic right now. Our reliance on gas is really putting energy efficiency on the spotlight. But I think this is really a multifaceted priority because, basically buildings count for more than a third of the EU's carbon emissions. We have, it's been mentioned already, we have more than 30 million people who are in energy poverty situations. But it's also an economic issue. That's what I wanted to flag. If we achieve the EU's target for energy efficiency, we would save collectively 50 billion euros per year on energy expenditure. So I don't know exactly how much of that goes to Russia right now, but still some kind of figures to have in mind. But more crucially, and that links to the European Central Bank, right now half of the inflation that we see is due to energy. So I'm going to, the next slide actually shows this. Oops, what's going on? So this is the inflation data that the ECB tells us, and look at the light blue part, that's energy prices. So right now we have around 5% inflation on average in Europe, but in certain countries like in Eastern Europe, it's much more closer to 10%, and half of that is due to energy. So my point here is that the European Central Bank, whose mission is to make inflation, to keep inflation under 2%, the ECB has a key interest in this matter. And perhaps they did not realize that 1 year ago, but right now I think the ECB needs to understand that energy efficiency is part of their mandate, because the more we get towards energy efficiency, just the lower the inflation will be for consumers in Europe. Just to show also the size of the magnitude of the issue, we're talking here about more than 200 million buildings that we need renovation in the next 20 years. And this represents an additional investment per year of, depending on the estimates, around, basically 200 billion or more, including public and private buildings. So we're talking about the magnitude that, and I think when we saw before the slides from Hannah, showing how much budget we have for each country, I think, or from Peter as well, I think we can all smell that something is wrong in terms of the numbers. We're not yet at the scale that we need. So a key issue, I think, is basically right now what people do when they renovate. Most people just basically use their own savings. So they wait until they're rich enough, basically, and then they pay the renovation work themselves, and maybe, of course, they also tap on the different subsidies that they have. But basically people wait until they feel that they're rich enough to afford renovation. And basically, if we continue on that trajectory, we'll never get there, basically, because obviously no one will ever get enough savings. First, not everyone will get enough savings at any point in their life, sadly enough. And simply, it just means everything gets slowed down. So this is really why public intervention is needed, so people don't wait. Okay, so my presentation is more about banks. So I wanted to explain a little bit why I think banks play a major role in renovation, and with all due respect to public programs that already exist, I think it's not enough. So the main point I want to make, it's been mentioned already, is that the big problem with grants right now is that many of them don't actually encourage deep renovation. What Anna called full renovation or deep renovation is really when people really do the overall of the house and not just partial renovation. And right now, a lot of the subsidies goes for partial renovations, and actually that is not going to cut it. At the end of the day, we know that for sure. I mean, I don't have the literature in front of me. I don't have time to explain that, but it's been scientifically proved that deep renovation is much more strategically important. The big problem as well, and that was touched upon, is that the problem is the grants approach that countries are making. And I'm not saying it should be done this way right now. I mean, until now, we had to do grants to initiate the process, but the problem right now is if more people want to do renovation, we're going to have a first mover stakeholder problem, right? Where the first people who go into this process get all the grants, and then there's no more money for the next people, right? So it's a big social justice issue, actually. Basically, the most savvy people get all the money, and then they won't be. And for example, in Italy, we also have a very the super bonus program is quite generous, but that's a big problem as well. Like if more people take up those grants, then the budget for the state that we will need for this budget will actually be like skyrocketing because it's too generous. So we can't really make this promise that we'll give grants for everyone. And just to maybe put some figures as well in our minds, deep renovation, it's about the cost of a deep renovation is around at least 50 to 60,000 euros per house. So do you think the state is going to be able to give this amount of money for everyone, for each household? The other problem is the delays. So usually, and it's been said by Peter in the Czech example, that the grants are paid afterwards. So that means people need to have the money for the upfront cost. In France, there was a study that shows that on average, the subsidies arrive 8 months after you start the renovation. So, you know, most people, especially vulnerable people, they just don't have the cash flow. So they need to pay for the upfront cost, and that's going to be a barrier. So all of that to say, I think you can smell my reasoning coming up, which is we need to get bank loans for people, affordable bank loans. We're talking about 0% bank loans, basically, or maybe 1% bank loans, because that's the average interest rate right now for mortgages. But we need to be able to let anyone who wants to renovate a home should be eligible for this kind of loans without limits, because right now many loans are really limited. And if you check on your banks, you know, your own banks, you can check it out. Usually what they offer on the renovation loans are consumer loans, which are like loans for a few €1,000, maybe with an interest rate of 5 to 6%. It's super expensive. And so we don't have the right product to make people go into a deep renovation process. So what's the barrier really? There's a lot of information here. I'm going to cut the story short. I think the big problem is for banks, these kind of loans, like 50,000 loans, it's a small amount actually for them. And you have a lot of fixed cost. So the profitability is quite difficult for banks. And the other problem is for these loans right now, and that's what we need to change. Right now, there's no guarantee on these loans. Usually, as I said, those loans are usually consumer loans. So there's no collateral. So for the banks, it's quite risky. It's risky to lend for people on renovation, unless if they are able to attach this loan to basically as a mortgage, basically to the value of the house as a backup. So that if they're not able to reimburse the loan, in the worst case scenario, the bank would seize the house. Of course, we don't want that, but that's the kind of logic we need to put in place so that banks will feel comfortable lending to citizens. But the good news is there's another way we can make that much more profitable for banks and for consumers, which is what you introduced as the so-called the TLTRO program. Forget about the jargon, we don't care about it. What it's all about is the fact that the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, currently lends more than 2 trillion euros to banks at a negative interest rate. At a negative interest rate, minus 0.5%. So what that means is that right now, the ECB is giving loans that make money for banks. Commercial banks are getting free lunch from the ECB through this program. The ECB has done that, to sustain lending into the real economy. There's all sorts of good reasons for that. What's interesting as well is that there's an incentive on this program currently that if banks don't lower their lending to the real economy, they get a minus 1% interest rate. So they have introduced this idea of having basically a carrot on top of the free lunch. So what we're proposing really is to make that program even more ambitious, but targeted on environmental conditions. So basically the program would work in a way that banks would get maybe a minus 2 or minus 3% on the proportion of loans that are renovation loans, okay? And so basically that makes it much more cheaper for the commercial banks to lend for renovation purposes. And of course, the condition will be that those loans will be equally made affordable for households down the line. So maybe to put things in the wider context, what we propose is that the EU should introduce an EU green renovation loan standard. So this would be a new type of product, which I could explain a bit later, maybe if we have time, but I think I'll try to finish my presentation first. Basically, those would be like typically 0 or 1% loan. Those loans could even be without reimbursement. What I mean by that is you could have a type of products where instead of paying every month to pay the loans every month, you could pay it back once you sell the house, or if you transfer the house, or in the worst case after 30 years. So basically that means the renovation is immediately profitable because you don't have more repayments to make on every month. But after 30 years, in a long time period, when you sell the house, you will basically part of the sale that you get, you will give it back to the bank. and by then, this whole operation will be profitable. Another concept that works together with the proposal is the notion of a mortgage portfolio standard. So this is actually being introduced right now in the recast proposal for the EPBD directive on energy performance building on the Article 15. There's this proposal that banks will have to analyze their mortgage portfolios. They will have to ask each of the consumers to provide an energy performance certificate. And therefore, the banks will have an analysis of in the portfolio who has, what are the A, B, C, D, and so on labels of the house. And from there, banks will have to achieve performance improvements on this portfolio. So basically, the banks will be obliged to inform consumers about the opportunities that they have for renovation. So that in combination to the proposal we have on the ECB to introduce a green discount interest rate, this will work together. And finally, once we've done all of that, what does it mean for existing public programs? They should largely continue. We're not advocating for smaller public budget for renovation. We're just saying those programs should be better targeted toward upskilling programs. So the program that Peter mentioned about the workforce not being there, technical assistance, that's really key, one-stop shops, and eventually perhaps also some grants for the most vulnerable groups, but those should be targeted. And also those programs should be all targeted to deep renovation and stop the small partial renovation. Okay, I think I need one more thing to say. We're actually launching a campaign right now and next month. The campaign is already live in France. It's called Unlock. And next month we launch in other countries, starting with Spain and at EU level as well. So yeah, stay tuned for this and don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested to join. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan. Well, we've got time to ask a few questions to you. I mean, firstly, you mentioned that low-income households or that people tried to save before they made these investments, which immediately kind of cuts out all low-income households. How do you think governments and these banks need to put these schemes in place? Do you think they need to have things like one-stop shops or renovation passports to help people to bring this renovation about?
Yeah, I think one key thing I would do is use the public budget to pay for the renovation passport for free for everyone who wants it, and perhaps working with the banks to nudge consumers. So what I would do is I would oblige the banks to look at their portfolio of mortgages and all the houses that are under G or F. I would force the banks to nudge those consumers and say, you're entitled to have an energy analysis of your house for free. And because then once you get people, in this journey, yeah, then people get interested, right? But we just cannot afford to wait for people to spontaneously go into that journey. We need really to nudge them.
And I think one of the things about how the Social Climate Fund is designed at the moment is, it has the money from ETS2. It's kind of guaranteed that it will have that much, and then that will be spread to the Social Climate Fund. With this, is there a concern that if there are just private banks doing this, that the money will be spread unequally, maybe across Europe?
Yeah, so I think I understand that that's the risk. I think that banks ultimately will just run for the most profitable kind of avenues and not the. I think this is where we have to put in place the regulation that we talked about. I think I'm quite encouraged that already in the energy performance directive of buildings there is already obligations for banks down the line to do this. But yeah, obviously this is not the silver bullet. I think what our proposal will do is mainstreaming renovation in a way that is equitable if people want to. But if I think a big flaw in our proposal is that I'm not sure vulnerable people will go to the bank and so on. So I think that's really certainly somewhere where public intervention will still be needed and grants will still be needed as well. But what I would emphasize is the the renovation loan product that we propose. Really, I think it's really like super. It makes everyone eligible because it makes the whole thing risk-free for banks. So there's no, once there's no repayment every month, the banks doesn't need to check on people's employment status and other criteria that usually discriminate against. So I still think our proposal makes it much better on the whole, But you know, I still think other type of social subsidies and support are needed.
And we've heard a bit mentioned today, the war in Ukraine and how it's affected these types of things. Have you seen a shift in the way banks in EU countries are looking at renovation and energy poverty because of that war?
It's a bit soon, I think, for me to say this, but I think everyone sees it coming. I think clearly we have signals that a big problem for banks right now will be that they're facing millions of people who are more and more at risk of insolvency. I mean, because of the energy bills, and clearly banks are sensitive to that. They know that they have a big problem coming up if nothing is done. So, but you know, I think right now this is creating more problems, I think, for banks than opportunities. I think. So I think that's why we need, again, that's why we need intervention to transform that problem into an opportunity actually.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Stan. I think we can now move on to our final panel of today. Our last presentation will be from Felix Meyer, an advisor on climate, energy and industrial policies from the European Trade Union Confederation. The group has criticised the idea of the Social Climate Fund being linked to the ETS for road transport and buildings. They propose other options of financing it, including using ETS revenues, as we've already heard, and the creation of a financial transaction tax, a minimum corporate tax, and a common consolidated corporate tax. After his presentation, there'll be another chance for questions, so please send any in. But first, to talk more about this, Felix Meyer, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Kira, for giving me the floor, and thanks also to the previous speakers, because I thought it was quite interesting and different perspectives. From my side, before going directly into the Social Climate Fund, I would like to start my intervention with a general comment, to take a step back and reflect a little bit on the taxation and system that we have at the moment. Because we are quite worried as trade unions to hear more and more from our policymakers that there is a narrative about shifting from labor taxation to environmental taxation. And you can see this in official communication from the Commission. You can see this in communication from national governments. And this is to us worrying, because environmental taxation is seen a little bit as a milk cow to both finance the transition and even sometimes finance the public budgets. I take the example of Next Generation EU, where part of the debt that has been contracted is supposed to be reimbursed with revenues coming from the ETS, for example. And this is also for reimbursement after 2058, which means that after the EU will reach climate neutrality, we still count on revenues coming from the ETS to reimburse EU debt. So we think that there is some inconsistency there. And another problem that we see is that environmental taxation, including carbon pricing policies, are in fact much more regressive than labor taxation at the moment, because it's kind of a VAT tax where everybody is affected the same, while labor taxation at the moment is progressive depending on your revenues. Finally, another problem with that is that, of course, if policy works well, such as carbon pricing, then the amount of money is limited in time, and therefore, for the sustainability of our public budgets, we need to reflect on other taxation systems. So what the ETUC is advocating for is to have a shift from labor taxation to capital taxation in order to reach a fair taxation system. And this should be complemented by environmental taxation to incentivize the people. But the objective of this environmental taxation, the primary objective, should not be to raise additional money. And we cannot rely on that money only to finance the green transition, and at the same time fight against the inequalities resulting from the transition. So I just wanted to start my intervention with this, and then I will come back to the Social Climate Fund, and you will see why I started with this. So just to be clear, we as ETUC, we do not reject the idea of creating a carbon pricing mechanism per se. We think that in some cases, like the existing EU ETS for industry sectors, such mechanism can help provide the right incentives, especially when we are talking about very rational actors like companies or industries. However, for us, these carbon pricing mechanisms should not be like the only climate action tool or the cornerstone of climate action, and they should be complemented by other regulations. And besides, we think that this does not work for all the sectors, and specifically for road transport and building, we think it's not the appropriate tools. I will not be very long on the reason why this we think it's not appropriate for road transport and building, but we can, of course, point out to the regressive distributional effects of this measure, the territorial and regional differences that exist in Europe. If you have a common carbon price in Europe, a household in Luxembourg will be affected much less than a household in Bulgaria, for example. I can also point out to the inelasticity of the transport and building markets, where to invest in an electric vehicle or to renovate your house necessitate high upfront investments. And therefore, it's very likely that rich households will be the one that will be able to make these investments. And in the middle and long term, it will only be poor households that will actually finance the social climate funds through this tax. Finally, last but not least, with such a system, there are some uncertainties related to the future price of carbon. We see at the moment that with the current volatility of the market, the price of the carbon is very unpredictable, and therefore for households it's quite difficult. So ETOC position on this is that we strongly welcome the idea of creating a social climate fund because we have already before the energy price crisis, we had 50 million households living under energy poverty. But we are against the creation of a second ETS on road transport and buildings. And we would like to finance the social climate funds with other means. And maybe I will end my intervention on several proposals that you already mentioned some of them, Kira. The first proposals that we have is indeed to create a financial transaction tax. It has been on the pipeline of the European Commission for probably decades, and it has been under discussion in many member states for a long time. And we think that now, with the current context, it's really the decisive moment to create this, and it's time to act towards this. In terms of revenue potential that this measure could generate, of course, it's hard to give a number because it depends on the exact design of the mechanism. But we could expect between 0.3% and 1.4% of the EU GDP. So we are talking about quite a substantial amount of money. In parallel to that, we could think also about common consolidated corporate tax base. There are currently some discussions that have advanced within the OECD, but we think that the proposal currently on the table could be further strengthened. And here, in terms of revenue potential, depending on the design, we are talking about between 1.3% and 3.8% of EU GDP. So here again, significant amount of money. A digital tax or digital levy, it could be linked to the common consolidated corporate tax base, so I don't enter too much on that detail. Another proposal could be a European wealth tax, and here again tackling a lot the inequalities. In terms of revenue potential, here we talk about between 1.6 and 10.8% of EU GDP, so it's huge. And what's important in this is that with such a European wealth tax, it would leave out 99% of EU households that would be completely exempted from this tax. So I think 99% of the household would not have to pay a single euro more. I think that's quite appealing if we are talking about social justice. So these are for taxation on capital. And then, of course, we can also use revenues generated by the existing ETS or the new carbon border adjustment mechanism to finance. I think Stan mentioned the role that the ECB could play. I think it's also something interesting. And finally, maybe to finance the investment in the long term, redesigning the Stability and Growth Pact and allowing public expenditure for green and just transition is also an essential element of how we could finance this. So just to be clear, we are not asking that all the revenues coming from capital taxation go to finance green transition. We think, of course, some of these revenues could also go to finance the public budget. But we think that it's needed to start thinking about additional ways to finance the green transition other than simply carbon pricing mechanism and environmental taxes. I will stop my intervention here, but I'm happy to answer any question, of course.
Brilliant. Well, maybe we could just start with kind of a question on the practicalities. You went a bit into this, but maybe go a bit further. How likely would it be that these new taxes would be passed, and what is the time frame for those?
So I think it will all depend on the political willingness, of course. And I mentioned that the FTT, for example, has been on the agenda for years. And the difficulty with these taxes is that we need, of course, the unanimity in the EU Council, and we all know that it's quite difficult. However, I tend to be a bit skeptical when people give me this as the only argument not to go for it, because the fact that the process is difficult should not be a reason for us not to explore this and to only stay on carbon pricing mechanism. Of course, the green transition is an unprecedented challenge, and I think this requires us to lift all the taboos that are related to the financing. And I also feel that the current context, both geopolitically and after the COVID, have shown that if there is a political willingness, we can really go far in what we can do politically, which was not the case maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So I think what we need to do as social movement is to increase the pressure on our government and really ask them to act on these proposals. And by the way, the financial transaction tax proposal is among the possibilities set up by the Commission to reimburse the COVID-19 debt, but still we haven't seen any proposal tabled by the Commission.
And I'll just follow up with a question from the audience. Are there any EU countries or possibly the European Commission who you are seeing are more in favour of these taxes?
Yes, of course. So you can see different sensibilities depending on the country. Usually also you see sensibilities depending on how much the specific country would gain from the tax and how much it would lose. So we know this kind of debate, and it happens every time there is a legislative proposals. I would say also that countries with more leftist governments are, of course, more in favor of taxing on capital taxation than others. But I think still it's necessary to put this on the debate, because so far I haven't seen much, at least on the newspaper or the media, such discussion on using capital taxation to finance the green transition. So it's really a call from my side to all the organizations that are here today to try to also help us develop this narrative around that, because if we don't develop that narrative and it's not debated in the media, then it will not be on the political agenda.
Now, if I can, I might pull back in one of our previous speakers from another panel. So we have a question, I'll just get this up now. How politically feasible is an EU green renovation loan?
I guess it's a question for me. We'll see. I think it's not currently on the table yet. So I think that would be perhaps the toughest battle in this big plan. I think the ECB, on the one hand, I think the ECB will feel forced to do something about energy efficiency, because clearly it's their interest and they've already committed themselves to act on climate. So I think clearly they have to do something. And now they're under pressure to act against inflation, which usually means raising interest rate, making money more expensive, if you like. But clearly, if they just do that, as they would do in the normal, in conventional times, now, if they were to do that, raise interest, they would just make the transition even more costly. So they will be forced to do something to fight inflation, while at the same time encouraging the transition to go faster. So this notion of a green discount interest rate, I think, will have to happen. Now, the renovation loan standard, the way I described it, like a 0% loan, with full guarantee on the house, plus full guarantee by the state at the last resort. I didn't mention that. Plus this idea that it's a zero coupon loan where people only pay the money at the very end of the process after 30 years or when they sell the house. This idea, I think, is the next big thing that we need to put on the table. It's not currently on the table, but I know that other people across Europe, experts, we're in touch with experts, and Peter Swetzman, for example, from Climate Strategies is one of them. We're in touch with those people. I think a lot of people are thinking about these kind of ideas. And what we know for sure is that the EBA, the European Banking Authority, is working on green loans and green mortgages. The European Commission is will review their mortgage credit directive next year. So I think it's kind of in the air. It's in the process. We know that there's going to be work to do at the legislative level on this type of product. We just don't know yet whether the policymakers will be keen to go a bit radical on this one.
Thank you. And Felix, maybe coming back to you. So, I mean, the European Commission would probably say that these climate taxes are not designed to last forever. They are designed to eventually run out as people go more green. But the reason they're maybe in place is to drive that green movement. How do you think the green transition could be driven if there was more of a focus on more labour-based taxes and less to do with climate taxes?
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right, Kira, and that's exactly why in my presentation I said that we are not against at all environmental taxation, but we see this as a complement to, and the objective should be to incentivize people. And that's why, for example, we are not against an ETS for the industry sectors, because there we think that it can be an incentive for industries to invest and plan in the long-term investment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes to road transport and buildings, just to keep in mind that the ETS2 is not expected to bring significant energy savings. From what I could see, it's supposed to bring maybe 1 or 2 percentage point reduction compared to the initial baseline. And even still, that is still subject to a lot of uncertainties, because it's not automatic if a household doesn't think as rationally as a company that has a lot of strategic thinker and accountants, etc. And it's not automatic that if a household is hit by a carbon tax, that its immediate reaction will be to invest in a heat pump system or in an electric vehicle, because it depends a lot also on its investment capacity. And I think Stan in his presentation showed that at the moment, many of the investments are done with savings of the households. But what happens if this household has no saving? Then this household is simply hit by the tax, and it doesn't reduce its greenhouse gas emission at the same time. So we think that if we want to compensate the loss in the reduction of greenhouse gas emission, there are some solutions by using other regulations, standards or things like that, I think can help. Another way could be also to explore the energy taxation directive, because there we could maybe have a bit more control over the prices, and we could make it in a way that would be maybe a bit more progressive in the way that it tackles households, also between rural and urban areas and that kind of things.
And Anna, maybe I'll come to you on this point as well, because Germany was kind of one of the countries that was really pushing for this ETS too. In Germany, is there an idea that it will really help reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And what are the social concerns when it comes to the impact on vulnerable households?
I warned, at least before, that I'm not an expert on the ETS2 because I have a colleague here that works on it. From what I heard from him is that it's a bit ambivalent, because Germany in general is, I think, pushing the idea a bit. As I said, we already have this carbon pricing, which I find, especially for tenants, is not very socially just. So my personal opinion is I prefer other solutions than the ETS2. I really found the idea from Felix very interesting to use the financial transaction tax or something like that rather than an ETS2, because it primarily burdens low-income households rather than helping. It's not an instrument that supports low-income households.
And Petra, maybe just to bring everyone in, let's bring you in as well. So in the Czech Republic or across all of Europe, there are different levels of renovation. How would something like an ETS2, which maybe targets houses which have lower energy efficiency, how would that impact a country like the Czech Republic?
Yeah. I'm not sure how to respond this, because also I'm not an expert for economic expert or expert for ETS. I'm mainly focused on architectural or adaptational measures. But in the Czech Republic, the big issue is how to evaluate the renovation debt, how to increase the more and more renovations, how to make this. But as I said before, nowadays we have the opposite problems. We can make the projects, but we cannot realize them. We cannot implement the measures. So I think this is the main goal of today's.
Great, thank you. And maybe coming back, no, of course, maybe coming back to you, Felix. So a lot of the taxes which you suggested will may not come in straight away. How can EU countries really mitigate the high energy prices and drive renovations maybe in the next 6 months or now?
That's probably a very tough question, and many people are discussing this at the moment. But I think there are several. I was speaking about taboos related to taxation before, but I think we need to also open other dossiers, such as the regulation of energy price markets, the liberalization of the energy market that was pushed for a long time by the European Commission historically, but we see that in such a times of crisis, we see the limits that this kind of approach is bringing. And I think all these topics need to be reopened at the moment, and we have to start a frank discussion and to really look outside of the box that we've been using for the last 20 years. Because if we are not looking at solution to regulate the energy price market, or to think again the way that the energy prices are fixed, at the moment it makes no real sense that the price are fixed on the marginal cost of the most costly energy plants. Because if we look at the renewable energy such as wind or solar, they have a cost that is much less than what we are actually paying our electricity on the market. So all this discussion needs to be on the agenda. I think also other elements such as a ban on disconnection for energy poor households, etc. All these elements I think should be on the table to protect the most vulnerables.
Thank you, Felix, and thank you all our speakers today. Thanks also to our audience for joining us. To close our event today, we'll go back to Alice from FEANTSA for the final words. So Alice, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kira. Thank you for this exciting contribution. I will come back shortly to what we can remember from today's roundtable before I conclude. So on the use of the ETS revenue to finance the renovation program, we have seen that solutions already exist at the national level. These programs, they are not perfect. One of them even made the choice to turn to other revenue recently, but these examples are rare in Europe and very interesting because they teach us lessons on how to use or not this existing revenue, because it's a solution promoted by a lot of actors. we saw that solutions are being developed in these national examples, or they could be imagined to enable low-income households to benefit from this revenue in the context of the renovation wave. Regarding the new green saving program in Czech Republic, we saw that new measures are being prepared to tackle energy poverty, such as a bonus for low-income households that apply for a subsidy for the energy reconstruction of their house, or support up to 90%, so we can see in the slides, the cost for energy reconstruction of apartment house in place of social housing, and loan for low-income households that apply for subsidy from the new green savings program. Regarding the German funding scheme for efficiency that Anna Wolf presented, we saw the shortcomings of it, such as the incomplete reporting, the fact that it was mostly used for new buildings and not in line with the climate goals. But we also learned some recommendations from Ms. Anna Wolf, such as permanently increasing funding to 25 billion euros per year. The fact that the funding also should focus on the renovation of the existing building stock and with climate compatible standards. She also talked about a bonus for private low-income owners and the importance of a long-term planning for the success of using these revenues. Regarding Mr. Stan Jordan's presentation, we saw he explained some limitations of public programs and the fact that banks and also the European Central Bank could play a decisive role in supporting low-income households in the transition. Mr. Jordan explained that the current use of public money for energy isn't optimal to achieve environmental targets, and that's, yeah, as we repeated, renovations are done with mainly savings of households, and this can't be enough. He talked about the necessary to make the banking sector play its part in unlocking trillions for renovation, and that a combination of innovative financial instruments and green discount rates by the European Central Bank refinancing operations, this could make cheap loans available for households. Finally, we saw that new funding could also be made available to finance the Social Climate Fund through a fair taxation system with the introduction, for example, of new taxes that Mr. Felix Maillot presented, such as financial transaction tax, a common consolidated corporate tax, a digital tax or wealth tax. He talked about the importance of the political willingness to achieve these measures, and to do so we have to increase the pressure on government. Even if this is a difficult process, we face an unprecedented challenge, and as we said, it's important to lift the taboos in terms of refinancing. All in all, I hope this event has shown that the creativity is necessary to avoid as much as possible that the most vulnerable people must pay for the renovation wave. I want to also highlight the fact that there is still time to influence the debate on the Social Climate Fund. You have the complete agenda online, but the deadline for tabling compromise amendments, it's the 8th of April. Finally, I would do some quick announcements about FEANTSA related news. So if you're interested, you can stay tuned for the new report that we will be publishing soon on using the ETS1 revenues to finance the renovations for low-income households. Our next online event, it's on the new European Bauhaus. It's on the 24th of March, and you can find all the information on our website. And I would like also to say that the registrations are now open for FEANTSA Policy Conference 2022. Yes, the 2022. It's in person, it's in Dublin, and it's on the 2nd and 3rd of June. So yeah, that's the end of this roundtable. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you to the speakers, and also to Kira for moderating this roundtable. I hope to see you at our next event. And yeah, I wish you a good end of the day. Thank you a lot to everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.